Hey there, church. Tasha here. For many of us, it's been a really tough week. Last week, we were praying for somebody in hospital, and unfortunately, on Sunday night, they passed away. And we were believing for a miracle. And so it brings up for many of us, lots of questions, confusion, pain. And so I just really wanted to bring something today just to encourage you as you process that pain and that confusion. And the first is this: the art of lamenting. And I call it an art because I do believe it's a really beautiful expression of prayer. It's a really beautiful expression of our communication with God. We see laments throughout the Bible. A third of the Psalms are lament psalms. Every prophetic book in the Old Testament, apart from Haggai, has a lament poem in it. And then we have the book Lamentations, which in Hebrew is Eka, which means how. And that is basically what we read throughout Lamentations. How, God, how did this happen? Or why did this happen? And that's what we can see when we read these lament poems. One of my favourite lament psalms is Psalm 22 because of its real vivid imagery of what David is actually experiencing. He talks about his tongue being stuck to the top of his mouth because he's so thirsty. He talks about his bones being on display because he feels so broken. But what we see throughout this lament psalm, or Psalm 22, is that he spends so much time telling God how he is feeling and what he's actually experiencing, what's going on around him. And he tells God all about that. And then he even tells God past times that God has spoken, past times that God has broken in, past times that God has saved him. He reminds God of those times, and he reminds himself of those times. And it isn't until verse 20-21 that he actually puts in a request. For many of us, I know myself included, often go to God with a request first. But actually, God is desperate to hear our heart. He's desperate to hear what we're going through and what we're feeling. And in this season that we're in, we really need to take our time and really lament to God. Tell him how we're feeling. Tell him that we're confused or got questions or that we're feeling pain or sadness. Tell him those things, and he will intervene in those moments. I really believe lamenting is God's invitation to us to process the pain that we're in, to process the confusion. It's his invitation to us. So let's accept that invitation and enter into that beautiful expression of our prayers to God. The second thing I really wanted to highlight was something that Bill Johnson says, and he says this: if we want the peace that surpasses understanding, we have to give up our right to understand. And I think that's so powerful for this moment. We don't understand why God didn't break in and bring a miracle last week. We don't understand it. I don't understand it, and I'm sure you don't either. But I know that to have the peace that God brings, I have to give up that right to understand. And it's tough to do, but that's how we get that peace. One thing that I found really helpful is an analogy that the Bible Project shared on a podcast about Job. And what they shared was this: If I tell my child Nevaeh not to lie, as a child, her understanding is I can't lie. As an adult, I know that that's a principle I want to follow, apart from when I need to lie to save others. For example, if I knew I had to lie in order to save 20 people, I would do that. As a child, they wouldn't understand that, and they think that lying is wrong anyway, no matter what. And that's what it's a bit like with us and God. We have a limited perspective, and God has an eternal perspective. He gets to see the bigger picture. He can see the end from the beginning, and we don't get to see that. And so we need to trust that no matter what, God is good, God is loving, God is just, God is right, God is sovereign. And we need to trust that and let go of our understanding, because we have that limited perspective, not an eternal perspective that God has. So I hope that encourages you today as you process your pain and your confusion. It's healthy to process that pain and that confusion. And so enter into it with God at the center. Bring him into that discovery and that learning as you give up your right to understand and you accept his peace and you lament and find his wholeness through that. Love you, church.